My name is Dmitry Volkov, and I spent 15 years working the coal seams beneath Blair Mountain in West Virginia. I came to America from Siberia thinking I had left the darkness behind, but what I found in those tunnels was older and hungrier than anything I had ever encountered in the Russian winter. The morning of September 15th began like countless others. I clocked in at the mine entrance as the first light struggled through thick Appalachian fog that clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers. The air smelled of earth and coal dust, a scent I had learned to breathe alongside the stale mine atmosphere. Each day the mountain swallowed us whole, and its ancient secrets stayed buried deep beneath layers of rock and shadow. But that Tuesday morning, something felt different. The foreman, a weathered man named Jackson, who had worked these tunnels for 30 years, handed me my equipment with a serious expression I had never seen before. "Dmitry, keep your eyes sharp today. Something has been stirring in the lower shafts. The night shift reported sounds that do not belong down there." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease settling in my gut like cold stone. Mines are old places where sounds echo strangely, footsteps multiply in the darkness, and shadows stretch too long. It is easy for the mind to play tricks when you spend your days buried alive, until it is not tricks anymore. Descending into the earth via the rickety elevator, the familiar clangs and groans of ancient machinery greeted me. I passed through well-worn tunnels, their walls slick with centuries of moisture and coal dust that clung to everything like the grime of generations. The deeper shafts held stories that the old miners whispered in hushed tones during lunch breaks, tales of something that haunted the darkest veins, a creature that was either guardian or curse, depending on who told the story. They called it the Shawnee Shade, claiming it was the vengeful spirit of the indigenous people who once considered this mountain sacred ground. My assigned section that day was Level 7, one of the deepest operational areas in the mine. The elevator descended for what felt like an eternity, each floor marker counting down like a death sentence. When the cage finally shuddered to a stop, the silence was absolute. No machinery hummed, no voices echoed from distant tunnels. Even my headlamp seemed dimmer in this profound darkness. About 4 hours into my shift, working in a lesser-used shaft that branched off from the main artery, my flashlight began to flicker. The beam struggled to cut through darkness that seemed unnaturally dense, almost solid. That is when I first heard it, a low, wet dragging sound echoing faintly from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like something massive being pulled across stone. Cautiously, I crept forward, my tools forgotten. The air grew heavier with each step, colder despite the natural warmth of the deep earth. The silence bent around me like a living shroud, broken only by that terrible dragging sound growing steadily closer. My radio crackled with static when I tried to call the surface, but no clear signal could penetrate the stone above. Then I saw it. Not fully at first, just a fleeting glimpse between the wooden support beams. A massive shape moved in the peripheral vision of my trembling light, something that should not exist in any earthly taxonomy. Scales the size of dinner plates caught my beam for an instant, glinting with an oily iridescence that made my eyes water. The creature moved with unnatural speed and impossible grace for something so large, its form undulating like liquid mercury in the narrow confines of the tunnel. When my light finally found its head, I froze completely. Two eyes reflected pure blackness back at me. Not the typical shine of animal eyes, but voids that seemed to drink in the light itself. The face was serpentine yet somehow more terrible than any snake, with features that suggested intelligence far beyond animal cunning. This was something ancient, something that had claimed these depths long before the first pickaxe ever struck coal. The creature let out a sound that will haunt me until my dying day. It was a low, guttural vocalization that vibrated through the rock itself, through my bones, through the very core of my being. The sound was older than the mountain, older than human language, and it told me with absolute certainty that I was no longer in a place ruled by mankind. This was its domain, and I was the intruder. Survival instinct finally broke through my paralysis. I turned and sprinted back toward the main shaft, my heavy boots pounding against coal-stained earth. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its massive body scraping against the tunnel walls as it moved with horrifying speed. The dragging sound became a rushing torrent of scale against stone. As I rounded a corner, praying I could reach the elevator, the ground beneath my feet trembled violently. A deafening crack echoed through the tunnel as a section of the ceiling collapsed behind me, sealing off any hope of escape the way I had come. Rock and timber crashed down in a thunderous avalanche, and suddenly my flashlight was the only source of light in a world gone completely dark. My radio was dead, crushed by falling debris. My primary light flickered erratically, the beam growing weaker with each passing second. The creature was somewhere on the other side of the cave-in, but I could hear it moving, searching for another way to reach me. Desperately, I pressed forward into unfamiliar territory, deeper into sections of the mine that had been abandoned for decades. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent life in my failing light. Ancient support timbers groaned under the weight of stone, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay and something else, something primordial that spoke to the deepest fears embedded in human DNA. I was no longer just lost in a coal mine. I was trapped in the belly of something alive and hungry. My salvation came in the form of an old ventilation shaft, long since sealed and forgotten by modern mining operations. With no other choice, I forced the rusted emergency lever, and the heavy metal door groaned open on corroded hinges. Stale air rushed out, carrying the promise of surface connection. I climbed upward through narrow metal rungs, my muscles screaming with exhaustion, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The ascent felt eternal. My hands bled from gripping the rough metal, and more than once I nearly fell into the abyss below. But finally, impossibly, I saw a circle of gray light above me. The surface entrance was overgrown with brambles and blocked by rusted grating, but I tore through both with desperate strength. When I finally emerged into the Appalachian forest, daylight hit me like a physical blow. The woods around Blair Mountain were silent, except for the distant drone of cicadas and the whisper of wind through pine needles. I collapsed at the abandoned shaft entrance, my body trembling uncontrollably as I tried to process what had just happened to me. News of my ordeal spread quickly through the mining community, but the company dismissed my account entirely. They blamed structural failures on old equipment and attributed my story to carbon monoxide poisoning and exhaustion-induced hallucinations. Official incident reports made no mention of any creature, no documentation of unexplained sounds or tremors. The legend of the Shawnee Shade was relegated to local folklore, mining superstition that had no place in corporate liability assessments, but the other miners knew. In the weeks that followed, production in the lower levels ground to a halt. Men refused assignments to Level 7, and several experienced workers quit without explanation. The company eventually sealed those deeper shafts permanently, citing safety concerns and depleted coal reserves. They never admitted what really drove that decision. 3 months later, I left the coal mining industry forever. I relocated my family to a quiet town in Montana, as far from the Appalachian coalfields as I could manage. I found work in surface construction, swearing never again to descend into the Earth's hidden places. But distance does not erase memory, and silence does not diminish truth. Sometimes, in the dead of winter nights when the wind howls like something alive, I dream of those dark veins beneath Blair Mountain. I see the creature still down there, patient and eternal, waiting in the deepest tunnels, where no human will ever venture again. And I know with absolute certainty that the mountain remembers me. The darkness is still watching, still hungering, and it will never forget the man who escaped its ancient domain. The Shawnee were right to call that place sacred. Some things should remain buried in the earth's deepest places, undisturbed by human greed or curiosity. But we never listen to such warnings until it is far too late, and the darkness has already marked us as its own. My name is Amara Okafor, and I used to document forgotten places across America with my camera. Urban decay, abandoned factories, ghost towns. I thought I had seen the full spectrum of human abandonment until I received a tip about an isolated settlement deep in the Kentucky Hollows. What I captured there through my lens changed not just my career, but my understanding of what exists in the forgotten corners of Appalachia. The assignment came through an anonymous email with GPS coordinates and a single line. Black Hollow, untouched since 1974. My portfolio specialized in documenting America's abandoned spaces, places where nature slowly reclaimed human ambition. This seemed perfect for my upcoming gallery show titled Forgotten America. I packed my equipment, a Canon 5D Mark IV, multiple lenses, tripods, and enough memory cards to document every crumbling detail. The drive into eastern Kentucky took me through increasingly remote territory. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks that my GPS could barely follow. The forest pressed closer with each mile, ancient hardwoods creating a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. When I finally reached Black Hollow, the silence was the first thing that struck me. No bird songs, no insect hum, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to muffle even the sound of my car engine. Black Hollow had been a coal company town, one of hundreds that dotted Appalachia during the mining boom. According to my research, it housed nearly 300 families at its peak before the seam played out, and the company pulled up stakes overnight. What remained was a perfect time capsule of 1970s Americana, frozen in decay. I began shooting immediately, drawn by the photographic possibilities. The company's store stood with its windows intact, but dark. Merchandise still visible on the shelves behind glass, clouded with decades of grime. A playground sat rusted and overgrown, swings hanging motionless on chains, green with corrosion. The most striking feature was the church at the Hollows Center, its white steeple still reaching skyward despite the collapsed roof below. As I worked, methodically documenting each building, I noticed details that seemed oddly preserved. Fresh flowers sat on some porches, too fresh for a town abandoned 50 years ago. Curtains hung in windows, moving slightly in breezes that I could not feel. Through my viewfinder, these details appeared normal, but when I lowered the camera, they vanished. The first photograph that truly disturbed me was of the old post office. I had framed the shot to capture afternoon light streaming through broken windows, but when I reviewed the image on my camera's LCD screen, there was a figure standing in the doorway. A woman in a floral dress, her face obscured by shadow, appeared to be watching me. When I looked up from the camera to check, the doorway was empty. I convinced myself it was a trick of light and shadow, perhaps combined with my imagination working overtime in such an isolated place. But as I continued shooting, more figures appeared in my photographs. Always at the periphery, always watching, always vanishing when I looked with my naked eye. An old man on a porch, children playing in yards where no children could be, faces in windows of houses I knew to be empty. By late afternoon, I had documented most of the town's main structures and decided to focus on the church for my final shots. Local folklore, what little I had found online, suggested the building was cursed. The story went that the preacher had performed strange rituals in the final days before the town's abandonment, ceremonies that mixed Christian worship with older, darker practices rooted in Appalachian folk magic. As I set up my tripod in the church cemetery, the temperature dropped noticeably despite the warm October day. My breath began to fog, and frost formed on the ancient headstones around me. The names carved in the weathered granite were mostly illegible, worn away by decades of mountain weather, but I could make out dates spanning back to the 1800s. I adjusted my camera settings for the golden hour light and began shooting the church's exterior. The building was more intact than many others in the hollow, its foundation solid and walls standing straight. Only the roof had partially collapsed, creating dramatic light patterns inside the sanctuary. Through my telephoto lens, I could see the altar still standing, with what appeared to be symbols carved into the wooden cross above it. When I reviewed those church photographs on my camera's display, every single image contained figures that had not been visible to my naked eye. Not just one or two, but dozens. They filled the cemetery, stood in the church doorway, and pressed their faces against the intact windows. Men, women, children, all dressed in clothing that spanned decades. Their faces were clearer now, no longer obscured by shadow, and their eyes reflected the camera's flash with an unnatural amber glow. Most disturbing was one image where a figure stood directly between my camera and the church, impossible close to my position. It was a tall man in a black suit, his skin pale as limestone, his mouth open as if shouting something I could not hear. In the background, the entire population of Black Hollow seemed to have gathered, all watching me with those amber eyes. As darkness fell, I packed my equipment hastily, eager to leave the hollow and review my photographs properly on a larger screen. But as I loaded my gear into the car, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Singing. Dozens of voices raised in a hymn I did not recognize. Words in a language that sounded like English, but somehow wrong, as if familiar sounds had been twisted into alien meanings. The singing grew louder as I tried to start my car. The engine turned over, but died immediately. And when I tried again, nothing happened at all. My headlights flickered, weakly before going dark. Even my camera's LCD screen went black, as if something was draining power from every electronic device I carried. In the darkness, I could see lights beginning to appear in the windows of Black Hollow's buildings. Not electric lights, but the warm glow of oil lamps and candles. Shadows moved past the windows, and doors that had been standing open began to swing shut. The entire town was coming alive around me, populated by residents who should not exist. I abandoned the car and began walking toward the road leading out of the hollow, using my phone's flashlight to navigate. But the battery drained impossibly fast, and soon I was walking in complete darkness. The singing continued behind me, sometimes seeming to come from the forest itself rather than the town. More than once I saw figures standing among the trees, watching my progress with those amber eyes. I walked through the night, stumbling over roots and rocks, following what I hoped was the road by feeling the packed earth beneath my feet. Just before dawn, I emerged from the tree line and found myself on a paved county road I recognized. A passing truck driver picked me up, concerned by my disheveled appearance and obvious distress. When authorities went to investigate my abandoned vehicle, they found it exactly where I had left it, but it started immediately with no mechanical problems. The official report suggested I had suffered from exhaustion and disorientation, common problems for city visitors to remote mountain areas. No one mentioned the photographs, but I still had those photographs. When I finally examined them on my computer back home, they showed details that defied rational explanation. The figures were clearer in high resolution, their period clothing authentic down to the smallest detail. The symbols carved into the church cross were visible, complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. Most disturbing was a series of shots that showed the progression of something approaching my position, a darkness that moved between the trees with purpose and malevolent intelligence. I researched Black Hollow obsessively, digging through newspaper archives and county records. The town had not been abandoned gradually as the coal played out. Instead, the entire population had vanished over a single weekend in October 1974. The official explanation was mass relocation for economic opportunities elsewhere, but no records existed of where they went. It was as if 300 people had simply ceased to exist. I never showed those photographs to anyone. The images remain locked in encrypted files on a hard drive I keep in a safety deposit box. My gallery show went on without the Black Hollow series, featuring safer subjects that did not stare back at viewers with amber eyes or whisper in the night. But sometimes, when I am alone in my darkroom, developing conventional photographs of mundane urban decay, I hear that singing again. Voices calling from Black Hollow, inviting me to return with my camera, promising to show me wonders that no lens has ever captured. They want me to document their existence, to prove that they still remain in that forgotten place where time stands still and the dead refuse to acknowledge their fate. I have thrown away 3 cameras since that trip, convinced that something followed me home in the memory cards. But the singing persists, and sometimes I catch glimpses of amber eyes reflected in shop windows or car mirrors. Black Hollow wants its story told, and it has marked me as its chosen chronicler. The photographs wait in their digital prison, each image containing more truth than the living world can bear. And someday, when my resistance finally breaks and the singing becomes too insistent to ignore, I will return to that hollow with my camera. This time, I may not leave at all. Some stories are too dangerous to develop, but they demand to be captured nonetheless. Dr. Henrik Larsson here, formerly with the United States Geological Survey. I specialized in Paleozoic rock formations and cave systems, but my final expedition in the Virginia Blue Ridge taught me that some geological features are better left unexplored. What I discovered beneath those ancient mountains challenged everything I thought I knew about both the Earth's history and what might still be living in its deepest places. I arrived in Shenandoah County in March 2019 as part of a federally funded research project aimed at mapping previously unknown cave systems in the George Washington National Forest. The Appalachian Mountains are a geologist's paradise, containing some of the oldest rock formations in North America, with layers dating back over 1 billion years. Our mission was to use advanced ground-penetrating radar and seismic imaging to create detailed 3-dimensional maps of the extensive cave networks beneath the Blue Ridge. The team consisted of 5 specialists, myself as the lead geologist, Dr. Sarah Chen handling mineralogy, Marcus Rodriguez operating our drilling equipment, and 2 graduate students, Rebecca and James, managing data collection and analysis. We established our base camp near Luray, not far from the famous commercial caverns, but our target area lay deeper in the wilderness, where no tourist had ever ventured. Our equipment was state-of-the-art. We had portable seismic arrays, ground-penetrating radar units, and a truck-mounted drilling rig capable of extracting core samples from depths exceeding 1,000 feet. The Norwegian government had loaned us their latest subsurface imaging technology, experimental devices that could map geological features with unprecedented precision. I was particularly excited to test these instruments in the complex limestone formations of Virginia. The first 3 weeks proceeded normally. We mapped several known cave entrances and discovered 2 previously uncharted chambers, both of significant archaeological interest. The limestone here was honeycombed with passages carved by millions of years of water flow, creating a 3-dimensional maze that extended for miles beneath the forest floor. Our seismic readings indicated the cave system was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The first anomaly appeared during our 4th week of drilling. We were extracting core samples from a depth of 800 feet when the drill brought up something unexpected. Mixed in with the typical limestone and sedimentary layers were organic materials that should not have existed at that depth. Fibers that looked almost like hair, fragments of what appeared to be scales, and most disturbing, tissue samples that our field tests could not identify. Dr. Chen analyzed the materials immediately, her excitement palpable as she examined the specimens under our portable microscope. "Henrik, this is impossible," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "These organic compounds are embedded in rock layers that predate complex multicellular life by hundreds of millions of years. Either our dating is completely wrong, or something has been living down there far longer than any known life form." The carbon dating results, when they came back from the lab, only deepened the mystery. The organic materials were indeed ancient, but they showed signs of recent biological activity. The cellular structure was unlike anything in the fossil record, yet the tissues appeared to have been alive within the past few decades. It was as if something impossibly old had somehow remained biologically active deep beneath the mountain. Our ground-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be a massive cavern complex at a depth of nearly 1,200 feet, far below any known cave system in the region. The chambers showed up on our instruments as a void roughly the size of a cathedral, with what looked like interconnected passages extending in all directions. Most intriguingly, our seismic equipment picked up rhythmic vibrations emanating from the depths, low-frequency pulses that occurred with disturbing regularity. "It could be underground water flow," Rebecca suggested during one of our evening briefings. But her voice lacked conviction. We had all heard the recordings of those sounds, and they were unlike any natural geological phenomenon any of us had encountered. The pulses were too regular, too purposeful, almost like breathing. Against the better judgment of my colleagues, I insisted we attempt to access the deep chamber directly. There was an existing cave entrance about half a mile from our drilling site that our surveys indicated might connect to the lower system. The passage would require technical climbing and sophisticated caving equipment, but it was feasible for an experienced team. We descended on a foggy morning in early April when the forest was just beginning to show signs of spring. The cave entrance was a narrow crack in the limestone, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Once inside, the passage opened into a series of increasingly large chambers, each one taking us deeper into the mountain's heart. Our lights revealed formations of stunning beauty, flowstone cascades, delicate soda straws, and mineral deposits in colors I had never seen in any cave system. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended, falling from the mild spring air above to a constant 40 degrees Fahrenheit deep in the caves. Our breath misted in the beam of our headlamps, and moisture condensed on the limestone walls in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like hieroglyphics carved by water and time. 8 hours into our descent, following passages that twisted and branched like the arteries of some enormous organism, we reached a chamber that matched the dimensions of our radar readings. The space was vast, our lights unable to penetrate the darkness beyond the first few hundred feet. But what captured our attention immediately was the sound. The rhythmic pulsing we had detected from the surface was clearly audible here, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. As we explored the chamber's perimeter, mapping its dimensions and taking photographs, Marcus called out from across the cavern. He had found an opening that led to an even deeper passage, one that angled downward into absolute darkness. The pulsing sound was stronger there, and when we approached the entrance, we could feel a faint current of air moving upward, carrying with it a smell unlike anything I had ever encountered. It was organic, but not quite animal, mineral, but somehow alive. That was when the tremor hit. The mountain itself seemed to shudder, and rocks began falling from the ceiling above us. In the chaos of trying to find safe shelter, I became separated from the rest of the team. When the shaking stopped, and I called out for the others, my voice echoed back from empty stone. I was alone in a chamber the size of a football stadium deep beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains, with only my headlamp to hold back the crushing darkness. I began making my way toward where I thought the exit passage lay, but the tremor had altered the chamber somehow. Formations that I remembered being in specific locations were gone, and new passages had opened where solid walls had stood before. It was as if the mountain had rearranged itself, deliberately isolating me in its depths. That was when I heard the breathing. Not the rhythmic pulsing that had drawn us to this place, but actual respiratory sounds, deep and wet, echoing from somewhere in the darkness beyond my light. As I stood frozen, listening to sounds that should not exist in any earthly cave, I realized that the pulsing had stopped. Whatever had been making that sound was now aware of my presence. The creature that emerged from the deepest passage defied every principle of biology and geology I had spent my career studying. It was serpentine in basic form, easily 50 feet in length, but its body showed adaptations to cave life that spoke of millions of years of evolution in absolute darkness. Its scales were translucent, revealing bioluminescent organs beneath that pulsed with their own ethereal light. Most disturbing were its eyes, or rather the complete absence of them. Where eyes should have been were sensory organs that seemed to perceive far more than vision could ever provide. The creature moved with impossible grace through the chamber, its body undulating across the uneven stone floor without making a sound. When it sensed my presence, it raised its massive head and opened its mouth, revealing rows of crystalline teeth that caught and reflected my headlamp beam like prisms. The sound it made was not quite a hiss, not quite a roar, but something that vibrated through the limestone and into my bones. My scientific instruments began failing the moment the creature fully emerged from its passage. My GPS unit displayed impossible readings, claiming I was simultaneously at sea level and several miles below the Earth's surface. My digital camera produced images that showed only static when I tried to photograph the creature. Even my headlamp began to flicker, its LED bulb struggling against some form of electromagnetic interference I could not explain. The creature approached slowly, its movements hypnotic and terrifying. I could feel its presence in my mind, an alien intelligence far older than human civilization attempting to communicate in ways that my brain was not equipped to understand. Images flashed through my consciousness. The formation of the mountains themselves, ice ages coming and going like seasons, and always this presence, waiting in the deepest places where the Earth's most ancient secrets lay buried. I ran. All my scientific training, all my desire to document and understand, evaporated in the face of primal terror. I stumbled through passages I did not remember, guided more by instinct than memory, while behind me I could hear the creature's movement echoing through the stone. It was not pursuing me with any urgency. Rather, it seemed to be herding me, guiding my escape route according to its own purposes. When I finally emerged from the cave system 12 hours after becoming separated from my team, I found a search and rescue operation already in progress. My colleagues had made it out safely, but had been unable to locate me despite hours of searching. According to their maps and GPS readings, I had emerged from a cave entrance that was over 2 miles from where we had originally descended through passages that their instruments showed as solid rock. My account of what happened in the deep chamber was met with skepticism from both my colleagues and the Federal Oversight Committee that reviewed our project. The failure of my equipment was attributed to the cave's electromagnetic properties. my disorientation to mild hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. The organic samples we had collected were confiscated for further study, and all our research data was classified under provisions I had never heard of. The cave system was sealed within a week of our emergence, the entrances dynamited shut, and the area declared off-limits for geological research. The official explanation cited safety concerns and unstable rock formations, but I knew better. They had found something in our core samples, something that confirmed what I had witnessed in that deep chamber. The mountain was not just honeycombed with caves, it was the lair of something that had been alive and waiting since before humans walked the earth. I resigned from the United States Geological Survey 6 months later, unable to continue in a field that had suddenly become too dangerous and too mysterious for academic pursuit. I returned to Norway, where I now teach introductory geology at a small university, carefully avoiding any mention of deep cave systems or unexplained organic materials in ancient rock formations. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the aurora dances across the Arctic sky, I feel vibrations in the earth beneath my feet, the same rhythmic pulsing I heard in that chamber beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains, transmitted through thousands of miles of solid rock. The creature I encountered was not unique. There are others sleeping in the deepest places of our planet, waiting for the right conditions to emerge into a world that has forgotten their existence. The Blue Ridge Mountains still call to me in my dreams, promising answers to questions that science is not yet ready to ask. But I will never return to those depths, never again disturb the ancient sleep of things that predate human understanding. Some geological features are better left unmapped, some core samples better left undrilled. The earth keeps its oldest secrets in the deepest places, and perhaps that is where they should remain. My name is Fatima Al-Rashid, and for 8 years I worked for West Virginia Child Protective Services. I thought I had seen every kind of family dysfunction and neglect imaginable until I drove up that mountain road to check on the Whitmore children. What I discovered in that isolated hollow changed not just my career, but my understanding of what can be passed down through generations of Appalachian families. The referral came to my desk on a sweltering August morning in 2018. An anonymous tip reported 3 children living alone in extreme isolation near Beckley, in a hollow so remote it barely appeared on county maps. The caller claimed the children had been abandoned by their parents and were surviving on their own in conditions that amounted to severe neglect. As a child welfare specialist with nearly a decade of experience in rural West Virginia, I had handled similar cases before, but something about this particular report made my supervisor assign it to me personally. The drive into Crow Hollow took over 2 hours, following increasingly narrow and deteriorating roads that wound deep into coal country. This was Appalachia, at its most isolated, where hollows carved by ancient streams created pockets of humanity, cut off from the modern world by geography and tradition. Cell phone service disappeared after the first hour, and by the time I reached the turnoff for Whitmore property, I was navigating by handwritten directions on a piece of paper. The house, when I finally found it, looked abandoned at first glance. It was a 2-story clapboard structure that might have been white once, but decades of weather had stripped it down to gray wood and rust stains. The porch sagged under the weight of accumulated junk, and the windows were so grimy they looked like clouded eyes. Weeds and wild growth had reclaimed most of the front yard, creating an impenetrable tangle around the foundation. I knocked on the front door and waited, listening for any sounds of life inside. The silence stretched on, broken only by the buzz of insects and the distant call of a crow. Just as I was preparing to walk around the property to look for other entrances, I heard it. The soft sound of children's voices, muffled by the walls but unmistakably present. They were speaking in hushed tones, as if they were afraid of being overheard. When I knocked again, this time more insistently, the voices inside immediately stopped. I identified myself clearly, explaining that I was with Child Protective Services and needed to speak with the children about their living situation. Minutes passed before I heard the scrape of furniture being moved away from the door, followed by the slow turn of multiple locks. The girl who opened the door was perhaps 12 years old, with a prematurely serious expression that comes from shouldering adult responsibilities too young. Her brown hair was tangled and unwashed, and her clothes were patched hand-me-downs that hung loosely on her thin frame. But her eyes were what struck me most, intelligent, wary, and far too old for her age. "You are Miss Fatima," she said. Not a question, but a statement. "I am Elsie Whitmore. We have been expecting you, though not today." Her speech had the distinctive rhythm of isolated Appalachian dialect, but there was something else in her voice, an accent I could not quite place. She stepped aside to let me enter, and I found myself in a living room that defied my expectations. While the exterior of the house suggested decay and abandonment, the interior was scrupulously clean and organized. The furniture was old, but well maintained, and every surface gleamed with careful attention. What disturbed me were the symbols carved into the wooden floor and etched into the walls. Intricate patterns that looked like a mixture of Celtic knots and something older, more primitive. Two younger children sat on a threadbare sofa, watching me with the same unnaturally alert expression I had seen in Elsie. The boy, who appeared to be about 8, had the same dark hair and pale skin as his sister. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 5, clutched a cornhusk doll that had been sewn with remarkable skill. Neither spoke, but both tracked my movements with eyes that seemed far too knowing. "Where are your parents?" I asked, settling into the chair Elsie indicated while pulling out my notebook and clipboard. The standard questions felt inadequate in this strange, clean house filled with watching children and carved symbols. "Gone," Elsie replied, matter-of-factly. "Mama disappeared when I was 10, and Daddy followed her into the mountain the next spring. Grandmother takes care of us now, though she's not here during daylight hours." The way she said this, as if it were perfectly normal for a caregiver to be absent during the day, sent a chill through me. I spent the rest of that first visit conducting a standard welfare assessment, but nothing about the situation was standard. The children were clearly malnourished. Their clothes were inadequate, and their isolation was complete. Yet they demonstrated knowledge and maturity that seemed impossible given their circumstances. Elsie could read and write with remarkable skill, teaching her younger siblings from books that appeared to be hand-copied manuscripts rather than printed texts. Most disturbing was their behavior as afternoon faded into evening. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, all 3 children became increasingly agitated. They gathered at the windows, watching the tree line with obvious anxiety. When I asked what they were looking for, Elsie simply said, "The watchers come with darkness. We must be ready." I left that day with more questions than answers, promising to return within the week with resources and possibly a temporary placement plan. But as I drove back down the mountain road, I could not shake the feeling that I was being followed. More than once, I glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that seemed to pace my vehicle through the dense forest on either side of the road. My second visit, 3 days later, found the house in complete darkness, despite the early afternoon hour. Heavy blankets had been nailed over every window, and when Elsie finally answered my persistent knocking, she looked exhausted and frightened. "They came early yesterday," she whispered, pulling me inside quickly and relocking the multiple deadbolts. "Grandmother says the old agreements are breaking down." The younger children were huddled together on the sofa, wrapped in quilts despite the summer heat. They had not spoken a word since I arrived, communicating only through looks and gestures that suggested a private language developed in isolation. The symbols on the walls seemed more prominent now, as if they had been refreshed or recarved recently. "Elsie," I said, sitting across from her and trying to keep my voice calm and professional. "I need to understand what is happening here. Who are these watchers you mentioned? Where is your grandmother? What agreements are you talking about?" She looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing whether I could be trusted with information that might be dangerous to share. Finally, she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our family has lived in this hollow for over 200 years. We are bound to this place by agreements made by our ancestors, agreements with things that lived in these mountains long before any white settlers arrived. According to Elsie, her family served as guardians or caretakers for entities that dwelled in the deepest parts of the mountain. These beings, which she called the Watchers, were neither good nor evil in human terms, but they required certain observances and protections to remain dormant. The symbols carved throughout the house were part of those protections, and the grandmother's nightly absences were visits to sacred sites, where she maintained other barriers. When Mama and Daddy disappeared," Elsie continued, "the burden fell to grandmother, but she's old now and the Watchers grow restless. They test our defenses looking for weakness. Sometimes they take people who wander too deep into their territory." She gestured toward a family photograph on the mantelpiece, showing parents who looked far too young to have simply abandoned their children. I tried to maintain professional skepticism, attributing her story to the isolation and trauma of abandonment. But as evening approached and the children's anxiety increased, I found myself reluctant to leave. The atmosphere in the house had become oppressive, charged with tension that made my skin prickle. When full darkness fell, I understood why the children feared nighttime. The sounds began as whispers in the wind, voices speaking in languages I did not recognize. Then came the scraping sounds, as if something with claws was testing the walls and windows of the house. The children huddled closer together, and Elsie began to recite words in that same unknown language, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each repetition. Through gaps in the blanket-covered windows, I caught glimpses of lights moving in the forest. Not the steady beam of flashlights, but shifting, pulsing glows that seemed to dance between the trees. Occasionally, these lights would approach the house directly, and when they did, the temperature inside dropped noticeably, and the symbols on the walls began to emit a faint luminescence. I stayed the entire night, huddled with the children in their protective circle, listening to sounds that no wildlife handbook could explain. By dawn, the disturbances had ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. But I had seen and heard enough to know that whatever was happening to the Whitmore children transcended normal social services intervention. My attempts to remove the children from the hollow met with unexpected resistance, not just from the children themselves, but from forces I could not explain. Each time I arranged for emergency placement, something would intervene. Transport vehicles would break down on the mountain road, paperwork would disappear from my office, and the children themselves would vanish whenever removal teams arrived, only to reappear days later as if nothing had happened. The case consumed months of my life as I tried to balance my professional obligations with the growing understanding that the Whitmore family was bound by circumstances that existed outside normal human experience. My colleagues began to question my judgment, suggesting that isolation and stress were affecting my ability to handle the case objectively. The final encounter came during a late October thunderstorm that knocked out power throughout the county. I received a call on my emergency phone, though how the call reached me through the storm and power outage I never understood. It was Elsie, her voice tight with terror. "Miss Fatima, you must come now. The agreements have been broken. Grandmother is gone, and the Watchers are coming for us. I drove through the storm on roads made treacherous by rain and fallen branches, guided more by instinct than by any visible landmarks. The Whitmore house, when I finally reached it, was surrounded by a fog that seemed to move independently of the wind. Shapes writhed within that fog, and I could hear sounds that made my rational mind recoil in denial. Inside, I found the 3 children standing in the center of the main room, holding hands in a circle around a pile of burning herbs and carved wooden tokens. They were chanting in that unknown language, their voices barely audible over the sound of something massive moving around the outside of the house. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each impact from whatever prowled beyond. "The protections are failing," Elsie said without breaking her concentration. "We cannot maintain them alone. The Watchers will claim us unless someone takes Grandmother's place." She looked at me with eyes that held terrible hope. "You have seen them now. You know they are real. Will you help us restore the agreements?" Before I could answer, the front wall of the house exploded inward, revealing shapes that defied description moving within the supernatural fog. These were the Watchers, beings of shadow and malevolent intelligence that had waited in the mountain's depths for generations. They flowed into the house like living darkness, reaching toward the children with appendages that seemed to shift between solid and ethereal. I grabbed the children and ran toward the back of the house, bursting through the kitchen door into the storm. Behind us, the building collapsed in on itself, with sounds of splintering wood and something far more disturbing: the cries of entities that should not exist in our world. We fled into the forest, guided only by Elsie's knowledge of trails that seemed to exist in defiance of the pursuing darkness. We spent 3 days hiding in an abandoned mining cabin deep in the mountains, while search and rescue teams looked for us. When we finally emerged, the Whitmore house was gone, not destroyed but vanished entirely, leaving only a circular patch of ground where nothing would grow. The children were placed in emergency foster care, but their trauma ran far deeper than any therapy could reach. I resigned from Child Protective Services 6 months later, unable to reconcile what I had experienced with the demands of bureaucratic social work. The children were eventually adopted by families outside West Virginia, though I maintained contact with Elsie through letters. She adapted to normal life with remarkable resilience, but she carried with her the knowledge of what existed in the deep places of Appalachia. The Whitmore case taught me that some family situations transcend conventional intervention, that there are responsibilities and burdens passed down through generations that cannot be addressed through standard child welfare protocols. In those ancient mountains, where human settlement is measured in centuries rather than decades, older agreements and darker obligations still hold power over the living. Sometimes, driving through remote sections of West Virginia on other cases, I feel the weight of unseen watchers in the forest depths. The mountains remember, and they wait patiently for the return of those who understand the true cost of calling Appalachia home. My name is Rajesh Patel, and for 22 years, I have served with Tennessee Emergency Medical Services. I have responded to everything from heart attacks to industrial accidents, from car crashes that defy survival to overdoses that push the human body beyond its limits. But the call that came in from Frozen Head State Park on July 15th, 2020, changed my understanding of what emergencies truly exist in the deep places of Appalachia. The dispatch came through at 2:47 p.m., classified as a wilderness rescue with potential spinal trauma. A group of hikers reported that their companion, a 34-year-old male named Thomas Green, had fallen from a rocky outcropping and was unconscious with severe head injuries. The location was deep within Frozen Head State Park, accessible only by foot over treacherous mountain terrain. As a paramedic with extensive wilderness rescue training, I was assigned to lead the response team. My partner that day was Marcus Williams, a veteran EMT with 15 years of experience in mountain rescues. Our third team member was Sarah Kim, a wilderness rescue specialist who could navigate the park's most remote areas blindfolded. We loaded our equipment into the ambulance and made the 40-minute drive to the park entrance, where we would transition to backpacks and hiking gear for the final approach to the accident site. Frozen Head State Park sits in the Cumberland Mountains of Tennessee, encompassing over 24,000 acres of rugged wilderness. The park gets its name from the distinctive peak that remains snow-capped well into spring, creating an island of winter in the Appalachian landscape. Local Cherokee had considered the area sacred, believing it was a place where spirits could cross between worlds. I had never paid much attention to such folklore until that afternoon. We began our hike at 3:30 p.m., following the Chimney Top Trail before branching off onto less maintained paths that would take us to the coordinates provided by the reporting party. The afternoon was unusually warm for July, but as we climbed higher into the mountains, the temperature began to drop noticeably. More disturbing was the silence. The usual sounds of forest life, bird calls, insect hum, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, gradually faded until we were walking through an unnatural quiet that seemed to absorb our footsteps and voices. About 2 miles into our hike, our radios began experiencing interference. Static would burst through our communications with bass, often accompanied by what sounded like voices speaking in languages I did not recognize. Marcus, who had been a radio operator in the Army, tried adjusting frequencies, but the interference only grew worse as we climbed higher. The coordinates led us to a section of the park I had never seen before, despite numerous rescues in the area over the years. The trees here were older, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes, and the undergrowth was sparse, as if plant life struggled to take root in this particular soil. Most unsettling was the ground itself, which seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency pulse that I could feel through the soles of my boots. When we reached the GPS coordinates provided by the hikers, we found no sign of any accident scene, no injured hiker, no signs of recent human activity, no indication that anyone had been in this area for weeks or possibly months. What we did find was far more disturbing. A scattering of camping equipment that looked as if it had been torn apart by something with massive claws, and a trail of what appeared to be blood leading deeper into the forest. Sarah examined the torn equipment while I tried to establish radio contact with our base station. My radio was completely dead, producing no sound at all despite showing full battery power. Marcus was experiencing similar equipment failures. His GPS unit displayed coordinates that placed us simultaneously in Tennessee, Alaska, and what appeared to be underwater in the Pacific Ocean. As we followed the blood trail, I began to notice physical symptoms that alarmed me. My pulse oximeter, a device I always carried to monitor my own condition during strenuous rescues, was giving impossible readings. My oxygen saturation appeared to be fluctuating between dangerously low levels and readings above 100%, which should be physiologically impossible. More concerning was the gradual numbness spreading through my extremities, as if I were developing frostbite despite the summer heat. The blood trail led us to a clearing that defied natural explanation. The space was perfectly circular, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, with soil that was completely barren despite the lush vegetation surrounding it. In the center of the clearing sat a pool of water, so still and dark it looked like black glass. The water reflected the sky above, but the reflection showed stars, even though it was mid-afternoon with clear blue skies. As we approached the pool, the vibration beneath our feet intensified until it was no longer just a feeling but an audible hum that seemed to resonate in our bones. Marcus stumbled, grabbing onto a nearby tree for support, and when I looked at him, I saw that his lips were turning blue despite the warm temperature. Sarah had stopped moving entirely, staring at the pool with an expression of terrified fascination. That was when they emerged from the forest around us. At first, they appeared to be simply shadows moving between the trees, but as they drew closer, I realized I was looking at something that challenged every principle of biology I had learned in my medical training. They were humanoid in basic shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, with limbs that bent at impossible angles and skin that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. The largest of these entities approached within 20 feet of our position, and I got a clear look at what we were facing. Its head was elongated and featureless, except for eyes that glowed with their own internal light. When it opened what might have been its mouth, I saw not teeth, but a void that seemed to extend far deeper than the creature's skull could possibly contain. The sound it made was not quite a growl, not quite speech, but something that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the primal fear centers of my brain. My medical training kicked in despite the impossible circumstances. I checked my own vital signs and found that my body temperature had dropped to 89 degrees Fahrenheit, a level that should have left me unconscious. My blood pressure was dangerously elevated, and my hands were shaking so violently I could barely operate my equipment. When I tried to take Marcus's pulse, I found that his heart rate was over 200 beats per minute, far beyond what a human heart should be able to sustain. The entities began to move in a coordinated pattern around the clearing, herding us toward the dark pool at the center. As they moved, the vibration intensified until small stones began dancing on the ground around us. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see our breath misting in the air. My portable thermometer registered minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, readings that were impossible in July, Tennessee. Sarah collapsed first, convulsing on the ground while babbling about the spaces between spaces and the watchers in the deep places. Her pupils were fully dilated, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that I associated with severe hypothermia. When I tried to administer emergency warming protocols, my medical equipment began malfunctioning. The defibrillator would not hold a charge. The medication in my IV bags had crystallized into unusable solids, and my radio continued to emit that strange interference. Marcus and I managed to get Sarah onto her feet, and we began a fighting retreat toward what we hoped was the trail back to civilization. The entities followed, but seemed reluctant to pursue us beyond the boundaries of the circular clearing. As we stumbled through the forest, carrying Sarah between us, I could hear them behind us making sounds that might have been communication, or might have been something worse. The hike back to our vehicle took 6 hours, though my watch insisted only 90 minutes had passed. The forest seemed to have rearranged itself, with familiar landmarks appearing in impossible locations. We emerged from the tree line just as the sun was setting, though according to our departure time, we should have had several hours of daylight remaining. Sarah required immediate hospitalization for severe hypothermia and exposure symptoms that no doctor could adequately explain. Her body temperature had dropped to levels that should have been fatal, and she exhibited signs of neurological damage consistent with prolonged oxygen deprivation. Most disturbing were her continued hallucinations about geometric shapes that existed in dimensions humans could not perceive. The official incident report listed the call as a false alarm, possibly generated by hikers who had become disoriented and lost. Thomas Green, the supposed accident victim, had no record of entering the park that day, and no one matching his description had ever been reported missing. The torn camping equipment we found was attributed to bear activity, and the blood trail was explained as being from a wounded deer. But I knew what I had experienced, and the physical evidence was undeniable. All 3 members of our rescue team developed unexplained medical conditions in the weeks following the incident. Chronic frostbite on our extremities despite the summer heat, temperature regulation disorders that left us alternately shivering and sweating, and sleep disturbances filled with dreams of vast dark spaces and watching eyes. I began researching similar incidents in the area and discovered a pattern of disappearances and unexplained phenomena stretching back to the earliest European settlement of the region. The Cherokee had legends about Frozen Head being a portal to the spirit world, a place where the boundaries between realities became thin. Modern hikers and park rangers reported encounters with impossible cold spots, equipment failures, and sightings of things that should not exist in any natural ecosystem. 6 months after the incident, I requested a transfer to urban emergency services, unable to continue working in the wilderness areas where such encounters might occur. Sarah never returned to active duty, her psychological evaluation recommending permanent disability due to exposure-related trauma. Marcus completed his remaining 2 years with the service, but refused any assignment that took him more than a mile from paved roads. The medical profession trains us to save lives, to apply scientific knowledge to biological emergencies, to trust in equipment and protocols that have been tested under every conceivable condition. But there are places in Appalachia where medical science becomes inadequate, where the human body responds to stimuli that exist outside our understanding of natural law. I still carry my medical bag, still respond to emergency calls, but I no longer volunteer for wilderness rescues. The memory of that clearing, of the entities that emerged from shadows older than human memory, has changed my perspective on what constitutes a medical emergency. Some calls take you to places where the most advanced life support equipment becomes useless, where conditions exist that no textbook has ever described. Frozen Head State Park remains open to hikers and campers, its beauty and challenge attracting thousands of visitors each year. Most emerge with nothing more than tired legs and spectacular photographs. But sometimes, when the conditions are right and the boundaries grow thin, people encounter something that exists outside the normal parameters of wilderness rescue. The vibration I felt that day still echoes in my bones during quiet moments. On winter nights when the temperature drops and the shadows grow long, I can feel that same unnatural cold creeping into my extremities. My medical instruments sometimes register readings that should not be possible, as if my body retains some connection to that impossible place where the rules of biology cease to apply. I keep my equipment ready, knowing that somewhere in the Tennessee mountains, other emergency calls will come from places where conventional medicine meets its limits. The next paramedic who receives such a call may not be as fortunate as our team was, may not emerge from those deep woods with their sanity and their life intact. This is my warning to anyone who might venture into the most remote corners of Appalachia. Carry more than just medical supplies and emergency equipment. Some conditions cannot be treated with conventional medicine, and some emergencies originate from sources that predate human understanding. In those places, survival depends not on training or technology, but on recognizing when retreat is the only viable treatment option. The mountains are patient, and they remember. And in the deepest places where the modern world has never penetrated, things wait that view human emergency responders not as help, but as prey. The Dr. Isabella Rossi, formerly with the Smithsonian Institution. My specialty was pre-Columbian cultures of Eastern North America, with particular focus on the mysterious stone structures that dot the Appalachian landscape. The dig site in the North Carolina mountains was supposed to rewrite textbooks about indigenous settlement patterns. Instead, it rewrote my understanding of what lived in these ancient places long before human memory began. The grant came through the National Science Foundation in early 2017, a generous funding package that would allow me to investigate what local Cherokee descendants called the Watching Stones. The site lay deep within the Nantahala National Forest, accessible only by an old logging road that had been reclaimed by the forest decades ago. According to oral traditions passed down through 5 centuries, the area had been considered sacred ground long before European contact, a place where the Cherokee conducted their most solemn ceremonies and spoke with spirits that guarded the mountain. I assembled a small but experienced team. Dr. Marcus Chen, a specialist in Native American iconography from the University of Georgia, 3 graduate students from various programs, and 2 local field technicians who knew the mountainous terrain intimately. Most importantly, we hired James Crow Feather, an elder from the Eastern Band of Cherokee who had agreed to serve as our cultural liaison, though his acceptance came with multiple warnings about disturbing what should remain undisturbed. The hike to the site took most of a day, following animal trails and abandoned logging roads through dense hardwood forest that seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each mile. When we finally reached the coordinates provided by previous surveys, I understood why the Cherokee had chosen this location for their most sacred rituals. The site occupied a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside by thousands of years of water erosion, creating a circular clearing surrounded by towering oaks and hemlocks that blocked out most of the sky. At the center of the clearing stood the stone structure that had drawn us here. It was unlike anything in the archaeological record, a circular platform roughly 30 feet in diameter, constructed from massive stone blocks that had been fitted together without mortar. Each block was covered in intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to shift and move when viewed from different angles. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, rivaling anything I had seen from Mesoamerican cultures, yet carbon dating of organic materials found in the mortar gaps suggested the structure was at least 2,000 years old. Our initial excavation proceeded according to standard archaeological protocols. We established a grid system, documented every artifact in situ, and began the painstaking process of uncovering the site layer by layer. The early finds were typical of late woodland period occupation: pottery sherds decorated with complex geometric patterns, stone tools made from local chert, and evidence of seasonal camping by hunter-gatherer groups who used the site over many generations. But as we dug deeper, approaching the base of the stone structure, the artifacts became increasingly unusual. We found metal objects that should not have existed in pre-contact America. Bronze implements decorated with symbols that matched those carved into the stone platform, and what appeared to be iron tools bearing marks that suggested they had been forged using techniques unknown to any historical Native American culture. James Crow Feather grew more agitated with each unusual discovery. On our 3rd week at the site, he pulled me aside during lunch break, his weathered face grave with concern. "Dr. Rossi," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "my ancestors avoided this place for good reason. The stones are not just markers or ceremonial platforms. They are a prison built to contain something that should never be released." I tried to reassure him that we were conducting the excavation with the utmost respect for Cherokee cultural sensitivities, but he shook his head. "This is not about cultural respect," he said firmly. "This is about survival. The elders who taught me spoke of guardians that were bound to this place, entities that protected the balance between our world and something else. But binding such forces requires constant vigilance, and when that vigilance fails..." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. That night, the first unusual incident occurred. I was working late in my tent, cataloging the day's finds, when I heard singing coming from the direction of the excavation site. The voices were hauntingly beautiful, harmonies that seemed to come from multiple sources but blend into a single, otherworldly melody. When I emerged from my tent to investigate, the singing stopped immediately, and the forest fell into an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Over the following days, similar incidents increased in frequency and intensity. Team members reported seeing lights moving among the trees at night, always just at the edge of peripheral vision. Our electronic equipment began malfunctioning. GPS units gave contradictory readings. Digital cameras produced images filled with interference patterns, and our radio communications were constantly interrupted by what sounded like voices speaking in Cherokee. Though James insisted the words belonged to no dialect he recognized. The breakthrough came during our 4th week of excavation, when we uncovered a stone chamber beneath the main platform. The chamber was small, barely large enough for a person to crawl inside, but it contained artifacts that challenged everything I thought I knew about North American prehistory. Metal tablets covered in inscriptions that seemed to be a mixture of Cherokee syllabary and symbols from no known writing system. Pottery, vessels decorated with images that depicted humanoid figures with features that were distinctly non-human. Most disturbing was a series of what appeared to be journal entries, written in English on paper, that showed signs of significant age, hidden inside a metal container that had been sealed with wax and buried in the chamber's floor. The papers were signed by someone calling himself Brother Matthias and dated to 1924. According to these documents, a secret religious sect had established themselves at the site in the early 20th century, drawn by local legends about the stone platform's supernatural properties. Brother Matthias wrote about attempts to communicate with the entities that the Cherokee had bound to this location, beings he described as the first ones, who had inhabited the mountains since before human memory. His early entries were filled with scientific curiosity and religious fervor, but as the experiments progressed, his handwriting became increasingly erratic, and his descriptions more disturbing. The final entries spoke of success in their communion attempts, but success that came at a terrible cost. "The binding weakens," he wrote in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. "They show us visions of what lies beneath the mountain, of the vast spaces where they wait in patience beyond human understanding. But the price of such knowledge is our humanity itself. Several of our number have been changed by the contact, no longer recognizable as the men they once were." As I read these documents by flashlight in the confines of my tent, the temperature around me began to drop noticeably. My breath started misting in the beam of my light, and frost began forming on the metal surfaces of my equipment despite the warm May evening. When I looked up from the papers, I saw that the walls of my tent had become transparent, revealing the forest beyond in impossible detail despite the complete darkness outside. That was when I saw them. Figures moving between the trees, tall and graceful but wrong in ways that made my rational mind recoil. They seemed to be made of shadow and starlight, their forms shifting between solid and ethereal as they approached the excavation site. As they drew closer, I could see their faces, or what might have been faces, bearing features that suggested intelligence far older and more alien than anything human. I stumbled out of my tent, desperate to warn my team, but found the campsite empty. Every tent stood open and vacant, equipment scattered, as if the occupants had fled in panic. Only James Crowfeather remained, standing at the edge of the stone platform with his arms raised in what appeared to be a defensive gesture, speaking rapidly in Cherokee while the shadow figures circled him like wolves around a campfire. "Dr. Rossi," he called out when he saw me. "The containment has been broken. Your excavation has weakened the barriers our ancestors built. They are awakening, and they remember their imprisonment." As he spoke, the stone platform began to glow with an internal light, the carved symbols pulsing in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat. The shadow figures turned their attention to me, and suddenly my mind was flooded with images and sensations that no human brain was equipped to process. I saw vast spaces beneath the mountain, where geometric shapes existed in dimensions that had no names. I witnessed the binding ritual that Cherokee shamans had performed centuries ago, trapping entities that had ruled these mountains since before the continents took their current form, and I understood with a clarity that filled me with existential terror that our excavation had begun to unravel protections that had held for over 2,000 years. The last thing I remember clearly was running through the forest, branches whipping at my face as I fled toward what I hoped was the trail back to civilization. Behind me, I could hear sounds that no earthly throat could make, cries that seemed to come from the mountain itself, as something ancient and patient began to stir in its stone prison. I was found 3 days later by a search and rescue team, wandering along a highway 20 miles from the dig site, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My team was never found, though their abandoned equipment was discovered scattered throughout the forest, as if they had simply vanished while fleeing some unimaginable threat. James Crow Feather was discovered unconscious at the stone platform, alive but forever changed by his encounter with the forces we had unknowingly released. The official report classified the incident as a group hallucination brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty camping equipment. The site was declared unsafe for archaeological work and sealed off with chain-link fencing and warning signs. Within 6 months, the area was quietly purchased by a government agency that had no public identification, and access was permanently restricted. I resigned from the Smithsonian and accepted a teaching position at a small college in Vermont, as far from the Appalachian Mountains as I could manage while remaining in my field. But distance has not provided escape from what I witnessed in that stone circle. The shadow figures visit me in dreams, showing me visions of the vast network of similar sites throughout the eastern mountains, all containing fragments of the same ancient presence that waits patiently for the barriers to weaken further. Archaeological research is supposed to illuminate the past, to help us understand the cultures and peoples who came before us. But some knowledge comes at too high a price, and some excavations uncover things that were buried for the protection of future generations. The stone platforms scattered throughout Appalachia are not monuments to human achievement. They are warning markers placed by peoples wise enough to recognize threats that transcended human understanding. The Cherokee knew the truth about these places, and they tried to warn us, but academic arrogance and scientific curiosity drove us to ignore their counsel, to dismiss their spiritual beliefs as primitive superstition. In doing so, we may have begun a process that cannot be undone, weakening ancient barriers that were our only protection against forces that view humanity as little more than an infestation to be cleansed from their ancestral domain. I still receive letters, forwarded through university mail systems, from people who claim to have seen strange lights near the sealed dig site. Hikers report electronic equipment failures and disturbing dreams when camping in the area. Local Cherokee elders speak of renewed spiritual activity in the mountains, of ceremonies being conducted in secret to reinforce protections that modern science has inadvertently compromised. The watching stones are still watching, still holding back something that should remain forever contained. But the bonds grow weaker with each passing year, and someday, perhaps soon, the ancient patience will run out. When that day comes, the Appalachian Mountains will reveal their darkest secret, and the world will learn why some archaeological sites should never be disturbed. Until then, I carry the weight of knowledge that no textbook can contain, and the responsibility for unleashing forces that may ultimately prove beyond human ability to control. Kenji Nakamura, 15-year veteran of the National Park Service. I transferred to Great Smoky Mountains, thinking it would be peaceful work after years in crowded urban parks. The mountains taught me that some ecosystems have their own intelligence, their own methods of protecting themselves from human interference that go far beyond anything described in wildlife management textbooks. October 12th, 2019 started as a routine backcountry patrol. I was assigned to check the more remote sections of the park where hikers rarely venture, monitoring trail conditions and wildlife activity in areas that see maybe a dozen visitors per year. These deep forest patrols were my favorite part of the job, hours of solitude among ancient trees, where the only sounds were wind through leaves and the distant call of ravens echoing off mountain ridges. My patrol route that day took me along abandoned logging roads that dated back to the early 1900s, before the land became protected national park territory. The forest here was different from the popular tourist areas, wilder and more primitive. Trees grew larger, their canopy so dense that even at midday the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. This was old-growth forest, ecosystems that had developed complex relationships over thousands of years. About 3 hours into my hike, I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. The forest had gone completely silent. In 15 years of wilderness work, I had learned to read the subtle changes in natural sound that indicate everything from weather shifts to predator presence. But this silence was different. Not the hushed quiet before a storm, but the absolute absence of sound that comes when every living creature simultaneously decides to hide. My radio, which had been functioning normally all morning, began emitting bursts of static punctuated by what sounded like voices speaking in Cherokee. I had worked closely with tribal liaisons throughout my career and recognized the language, but these were not words I had ever heard before. The transmission came through clearly for several seconds before dissolving back into electronic noise. As I continued deeper into the forest, following a trail that appeared on none of our official maps, the temperature began dropping noticeably. My breath started misting in the air despite the warm October afternoon, and frost began forming on metal surfaces of my equipment. The GPS unit on my belt showed coordinates that placed me several miles outside the park boundaries, despite the fact that I had never left established trails. That was when I discovered the clearing. It appeared suddenly as I pushed through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth, opening into a perfect circle of bare earth, roughly 100 feet in diameter. The soil was blackened, as if subjected to intense cold rather than fire, and the vegetation at the clearing's edge looked stunted and diseased despite the healthy forest surrounding it. At the center of the clearing sat a pool of water that defied every principle of forest ecology I knew. The water was absolutely still, its surface reflecting the sky with mirror-like perfection, but the reflection showed stars and constellations visible in broad daylight, celestial patterns that belonged to no earthly sky. As I approached the pool's edge, the water began to emit a faint bioluminescent glow, pulsing in rhythm with something I could feel rather than hear. The vibration started as a barely perceptible tremor in the ground beneath my feet, growing stronger until it resonated through my bones like the heartbeat of something massive sleeping far below the Earth's surface. My equipment began malfunctioning in sequence. The GPS display flickered between impossible readings, my radio produced only static, and the digital camera I carried to document wildlife showed nothing but interference patterns when I tried to photograph the clearing. That was when I saw the creature. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a shadow moving at the edge of my peripheral vision, but as it emerged from the forest into the clearing, I realized I was looking at something that challenged every assumption I held about wildlife in the Appalachian ecosystem. It was serpentine in basic form, easily 40 feet in length, but its body showed adaptations that belonged to no known species. The creature moved with fluid grace across the uneven ground, its scales shifting color like oil on water as it caught what little sunlight penetrated the forest canopy. Most disturbing were its eyes, not the simple black orbs of a snake, but complex organs that seemed to perceive far more than visible light. When those eyes fixed on me, I felt a presence in my mind that was ancient, intelligent, and completely alien to human thought. My training kicked in despite the impossibility of the situation. I had dealt with aggressive bears, mountain lions, and even rabid animals during my career. I drew my service weapon, a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs designed to stop charging bears, and took aim at the creature's center mass. The shot echoed through the clearing like thunder, but where I expected to see the impact of the slug, the creature's scales simply rippled like water, absorbing the kinetic energy without apparent damage. The creature's reaction was immediate and terrifying. It reared back on its posterior third, rising to a height of nearly 20 feet, and released a sound that was part hiss, part roar, and part something else entirely. A vocalization that seemed to vibrate at frequencies that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to primal fear centers in my brain. The sound shattered dead branches in the trees around us and sent a flock of ravens exploding from their roosts in panic. As the creature began to move toward me, the environmental effects intensified. The temperature plummeted further, causing my breath to form ice crystals that fell like snow. The bioluminescent glow from the pool increased until it cast the entire clearing in an ethereal blue-green light. Most unnaturally, the forest itself seemed to respond to the creature's presence. Vines began moving with deliberate purpose, reaching toward me like grasping fingers. Tree roots erupted from the soil, creating barriers that seemed designed to prevent my escape. I retreated toward what I hoped was the trail back to familiar territory, but the forest had changed. Paths that I was certain I had followed into the clearing were gone, replaced by impenetrable tangles of thorns and fallen timber. The creature followed but made no apparent effort to close the distance between us. Instead, it seemed to be herding me, guiding my movement according to some purpose I could not understand. For hours, I moved through a landscape that grew increasingly alien with each step. The trees took on impossible shapes, their branches twisting into geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The very ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if the solid earth was little more than a thin membrane stretched over vast empty spaces. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, and the sun appeared to move across the sky far too rapidly, casting shadows that fell in directions that defied physics. As darkness fell, or what passed for darkness in this transformed landscape, the creature's bioluminescent scales provided the only source of light. It continued to follow me at a distance, its massive form gliding silently through terrain that should have been impossible for anything of its size to navigate. I could feel its intelligence focused on me, studying my movements and reactions with scientific curiosity. The psychological pressure was overwhelming. I found myself questioning not just the reality of what I was experiencing, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. The Great Smoky Mountains I had known and worked in for 15 years had been replaced by something older and far more dangerous, an ecosystem that operated according to laws that predated human understanding of the natural world. When dawn finally came, I found myself lying beside a snowbank at the edge of a familiar hiking trail, my equipment scattered around me and my body temperature dangerously low. The creature was nowhere to be seen, and the clearing with its impossible pool had vanished, as if it had never existed. My radio crackled back to life, and within hours, a search and rescue team located me and extracted me to the park medical facility. The official incident report attributed my condition to exposure and hypothermia, combined with possible hallucinations brought on by dehydration and altitude sickness. My superiors were sympathetic but concerned about my psychological fitness for solo backcountry work. The area where I claimed to have encountered the creature was quietly designated as environmentally sensitive and placed off limits to both staff and visitors. But I knew what I had experienced was real. In the weeks that followed, I researched similar incidents throughout the park's history and discovered a pattern of unexplained encounters stretching back to the earliest Cherokee inhabitants. The mountains were home to something that existed outside the normal parameters of wildlife biology, entities that served as guardians or caretakers of the ancient forest ecosystem. Cherokee elders I spoke with were not surprised by my account. According to their oral traditions, the mountains had always been home to spirits that protected the land from those who would exploit or damage it. These entities were neither good nor evil in human terms, but they maintained a balance that had existed since long before European settlement. Recent decades had seen increased activity as human encroachment threatened areas that had been undisturbed for millennia. I requested a transfer to visitor services after my recovery, unable to continue solo backcountry patrols with the knowledge of what might be watching from the shadows. But even in my new assignment, leading guided nature walks and educational programs, I remained acutely aware of the park's hidden depths. Occasionally, hikers would report strange encounters, equipment failures in specific areas, unusual wildlife behavior, or glimpses of something large moving through the forest canopy. These reports were always explained away as natural phenomena or misidentification of known animals. The Park Service had no protocol for dealing with entities that existed outside biological classification, so such encounters were systematically dismissed or attributed to human error. But I knew better, and I suspect some of my colleagues did as well. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to attract millions of visitors each year, drawn by the promise of pristine wilderness and scenic beauty. Most experience nothing more than the peaceful interaction with nature that they came seeking. But the mountains are far older and more complex than any tourist brochure can convey, home to ecosystems that have developed their own forms of intelligence and their own methods of self-protection. I still work for the Park Service, but now I carry more than just standard safety equipment. The mountains watch, and they remember, and they will protect themselves using methods that human science has yet to acknowledge or understand. The creature I encountered that October day was not an anomaly. It was a reminder that we share this world with intelligences far older than our own. On quiet nights when the mist rises from the valleys and the stars seem unusually bright, I can still feel that presence in the forest depths. The ancient guardians are patient, but they are always watching, ensuring that the sacred places remain protected from those who would disturb the balance that has existed since the mountains first rose from the earth. Reverend Olumide Adebayo, ordained minister with the United Methodist Church. I came to the mountains of eastern Tennessee to spread the gospel to forgotten communities, but what I found was a congregation that had never forgotten older, darker faiths. My experience in Pine Ridge taught me that some spiritual battles are fought not with prayer alone, but with an understanding of forces that predate Christian doctrine by millennia. The assignment came through the Tennessee Conference in August 2021. Pine Ridge was described as a challenging rural ministry, a mountain community of fewer than 500 residents scattered across steep hollows and ridgetop settlements. The previous minister had left abruptly after only 6 months, citing health concerns and family obligations. When I pressed for details, the district superintendent simply said that rural ministry was not for everyone and wished me luck. The drive into Pine Ridge took me deeper into Appalachian country than I had ever ventured. The roads grew narrower and more winding with each mile, carved into mountainsides that seemed to press closer with each turn. Cell phone service disappeared completely after the first hour, and my GPS struggled to maintain a signal among the towering peaks that surrounded the valley like ancient sentinels. Pine Ridge itself was a step back in time. The main street consisted of a general store, a post office, and a handful of weathered buildings that looked as if they had not changed since the early 1900s. The church I was assigned to shepherd, Pine Ridge United Methodist, sat on a hillside overlooking the community. A simple white clapboard structure with a modest steeple that reached toward the sky like a prayer carved in wood. My first Sunday service drew nearly the entire community, curious faces filling pews that had been worn smooth by generations of worshipers. The congregation was welcoming in the way that only mountain people can be, offering genuine hospitality to the stranger who had come to minister to them. But even during that first sermon, I sensed something beneath the surface warmth that made my skin prickle with unease. As I stood at the simple wooden pulpit, delivering a message about faith and community, I noticed that the temperature in the sanctuary seemed to fluctuate without explanation. Cold spots would appear suddenly, causing my breath to mist in the middle of sentences, only to be replaced by oppressive heat that had no natural source. The congregation seemed accustomed to these atmospheric changes, continuing their worship without apparent concern. After the service, several church elders invited me for coffee at the home of Martha Whitfield, a woman in her 70s whose family had been in Pine Ridge since before the Civil War. It was there, surrounded by quilts and family photographs that spanned generations, that I first heard about the spiritual complexities of my new ministry. Reverend Adebayo, Martha said, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. Pine Ridge ain't like other places. We've been Christian folk for over a century, but the mountains remember things that go back a lot further. Your predecessor, he tried to change our ways, said our old prayers were sinful. That did not end well for anyone involved. The other elders nodded gravely, and I sensed that there were stories behind their expressions that would take time and trust to uncover. James Crow Feather, one of the few remaining full-blooded Cherokee in the area, spoke up from his chair near the window. The church is built on sacred ground, Reverend. Our ancestors held ceremonies there long before white settlers arrived. The spirits that accepted those offerings never left, and they expect certain observances to continue. I listened carefully, trying to balance my theological training with respect for the cultural complexities of my new congregation. The Methodist Church had a long history of adapting to local customs while maintaining core Christian principles, but what these mountain people were describing sounded like something more than harmless folk traditions. Over the following weeks, as I settled into the rhythm of rural ministry, the supernatural aspects of Pine Ridge became increasingly difficult to ignore. During Sunday services, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source, shapes that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. Several parishioners reported similar sightings, describing tall figures that stood at the edge of the sanctuary during hymns, listening with apparent interest to our worship. The church building itself seemed to respond to our presence in ways that defied rational explanation. The century-old organ would sometimes play single notes or brief passages on its own, usually during moments of silent prayer. The wooden pews would creak and shift as if invisible congregants were taking their seats. Most disturbing was the altar area, where the temperature would drop so dramatically during communion that the wine would develop a thin layer of ice despite the warm Tennessee summer. My evening prayers became increasingly urgent as I struggled to understand the spiritual landscape I had entered. Traditional Methodist theology provided little guidance for dealing with encounters that seemed to blend Christian worship with much older spiritual practices. I began researching the history of Pine Ridge and the surrounding mountains, seeking context for the phenomena I was witnessing. What I discovered in old county records and Cherokee oral histories painted a picture of spiritual complexity that spanned millennia. The hillside where our church stood had been a sacred site for indigenous peoples long before European contact, a place where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds were believed to be especially thin. Early Cherokee shamans had conducted vision quests and healing ceremonies there, establishing spiritual protections that were maintained through generations of careful observance. When Christian missionaries arrived in the early 1800s, they had built their church directly on top of the ancient sacred site, either unaware of its significance or deliberately attempting to supplant indigenous spiritual practices with Christian worship. But rather than eliminating the older traditions, this had created a unique synthesis where Cherokee spiritual beliefs became interwoven with Methodist doctrine. The congregation of Pine Ridge had maintained this delicate balance for over a century, incorporating elements of both traditions into their worship in ways that honored the spiritual forces that claimed the mountain as their domain. The old prayers that Martha had mentioned were actually Cherokee chants that had been adapted to include Christian language, creating hybrid invocations that spoke to both Jesus Christ and the ancient spirits of the mountain. As October arrived and the leaves began to turn, the spiritual activity in and around the church intensified dramatically. Parishioners reported increasingly vivid dreams, filled with visions of ancient ceremonies and warnings about spiritual boundaries that must not be crossed. Children spoke of seeing mountain people in traditional Cherokee dress, standing among the trees during church services, watching our worship with expressions that mixed curiosity and judgment. The breaking point came during a particularly violent thunderstorm on Halloween night. I had gone to the church to secure windows and check for damage when I found myself trapped inside by winds that seemed to shake the building to its foundation. As lightning illuminated the sanctuary in stark flashes, I saw that I was not alone. The pews were filled with figures that flickered between solid and translucent. Men, women, and children, dressed in clothing that spanned centuries of Pine Ridge history. At the front of the sanctuary, near the altar where I conducted weekly communion, stood a figure that commanded immediate attention. Tall and dignified, wearing traditional Cherokee regalia that seemed to glow with its own internal light, the apparition looked directly at me with eyes that held the weight of ages. When it spoke, the words formed in my mind without passing through my ears, carrying meaning that transcended language barriers. The message was clear. The spiritual protections that had maintained harmony between the Cherokee spirits and the Christian congregation were failing. My predecessors' attempts to eliminate the pagan elements of local worship had weakened ancient agreements that kept far darker forces at bay. If the balance was not restored, entities that viewed all human presence as an intrusion would be free to reclaim their mountain domain through methods that would not distinguish between Cherokee descendants and Methodist ministers. Over the following days, working closely with James Crowfeather and the church elders, I began to understand the true nature of my ministry in Pine Ridge. I was not just a pastor bringing Christian salvation to mountain people. I was a spiritual guardian charged with maintaining a complex religious synthesis that protected both my congregation and the broader community from supernatural forces that predated human settlement of these mountains. We began incorporating Cherokee elements back into our worship services, carefully balancing Christian doctrine with recognition of the spiritual realities that governed life in this particular place. Sunday services now included moments of silence where congregants could offer prayers in Cherokee, acknowledging the ancestors who still watched over the mountain. We blessed the church grounds with both holy water and traditional herbs, creating protective barriers that spoke to multiple spiritual traditions. The most challenging aspect of this new ministry was explaining to the Methodist Conference why our services had taken on such distinctive characteristics. I filed reports that emphasized our respect for local cultural traditions while carefully avoiding details that might trigger denominational concern about theological orthodoxy. The mountain people had learned over generations to practice their blended faith quietly, avoiding the attention of religious authorities who might not understand the necessities of spiritual survival in these ancient hills. 3 years later, I remain in Pine Ridge, serving a congregation that has taught me more about the practical applications of faith than any seminary could provide. The supernatural manifestations continue, but they no longer carry the threatening edge that marked my early months in the ministry. The Cherokee spirits seem satisfied that their concerns are being acknowledged, and the church has become a place where multiple spiritual traditions coexist in cautious harmony. My theological perspective has expanded far beyond the boundaries of traditional Methodist doctrine. I have learned to see Christianity not as a replacement for indigenous spiritual practices, but as one element in a complex religious ecosystem that must be maintained through careful attention to local spiritual realities. The gospel I preach in Pine Ridge acknowledges that God's creation includes mysteries that human understanding has barely begun to explore. Late at night, when mist rises from the valleys and the mountain seems to breathe with its own life, I sometimes see the Cherokee spirits moving among the trees around the church. They nod to me in acknowledgement as I pass, recognizing a fellow guardian of the sacred balance that keeps their mountain home peaceful. In return, I offer prayers that honor both Jesus Christ and the ancient spirits who claim these hills as their eternal domain. Pine Ridge has taught me that true ministry sometimes requires acknowledging spiritual realities that exist outside conventional religious frameworks. The mountains are home to forces older than any human institution, and serving God in such places means learning to work within spiritual ecosystems that demand respect, understanding, and careful maintenance of ancient agreements. This is not the ministry I expected when I accepted assignment to a small mountain church, but it has become the most meaningful work of my life. In Pine Ridge, faith is not just a matter of personal salvation. It is a community responsibility that extends across generations and bridges the gap between different ways of understanding the sacred. The church bell still rings each Sunday morning, calling the faithful to worship in a sanctuary where Cherokee spirits and Methodist doctrine share the same sacred space. It is a sound that echoes across the mountains, carrying prayers in multiple languages to a God who, I have learned, speaks to different peoples in the spiritual languages they understand best.